Colonel, in November of 1986, after the Iranian venture had been publicized initially in Lebanon, then in papers all over the world, did you discuss the diversion with Director Casey?
Oh, sure.
Now, tell us about that, whatever you can recall.
Well, I don't recall I mean, we'd had several discussions about it.
Well, I'll
and
take
it was
all several.
My recollection is that Director Casey agreed with my assessment that the time had come for someone to stand up and take the hit, or the fall. He quite frankly did not think that I was senior enough to do that, and suggested that I'm trying to recall, but it suggested that it was probably going to go up the line or something like that.
Did he suggest who else could take the hit?
He suggested it might be Admiral Poindexter.
Because next up to the line from you was Admiral Poindexter, wasn't it, on this matter?
Well, after Don Fortier died, that's correct. Don Fortier was the nominal deputy who had been aware, I believe, at least of some of this.
Did you discuss blaming it on Fortier after his death?
It'd be hard to blame something that was going on in November on a man who died in the summer.
No, but the original approval.
No.
So that...
I mean, first of all, Don wasn't in a position to do those approvals. I mean, it was...
So Casey, Director Casey, as I understand it, discussed with you the fact that it just might not be credible for you to take the hit, and that it might have to be Admiral Poindexter?
Worse to that effect.
Did he discuss anyone else who might have to take the hit?
No, but he was concerned that the president not be damaged by it, and I shared that belief.
Now, these conversations with Director Casey took place before November 21, correct? Before and after?
I would guess so, yes. Now, one has to recall that I spent the first part of December, and you now have my travel schedule.
November, you mean?
I'm sorry, the first part of November in very heavy travel, and so did the director. But my recollection is that we had one conversation early in the month, perhaps during one of my layovers in Washington, and that the next conversations weren't until very much later in the month.
Well, Colonel, at the time you had that conversation in early November, you had not yet been told by Admiral Poindexter that he had not told the president, correct?
I was not told that by Admiral Poindexter until the 21st.
So that at the time you were having your conversation with Casey, you were still laboring under the assumption that the President of the United States knew, correct?
Yes.
And did Director Casey tell you the President doesn't know?
No.
And when you and Director Casey were talking about the fact that someone had to take the hit, why did you understand that it was necessary for someone to take the hit?
Well, I think he and I certainly could see that we were going to have a major international and perhaps, and we obviously do, a domestic political drama on this thing, and that it would be helpful if someone were, as we had originally planned, when it comes time for this thing to go down the tubes, here's the guy who gets fingered for it. And again, none of us, at least certainly not me, and no one I ever talked to, ever imagined that we had done anything criminally wrong.
Now, and you've testified that the director was known to you to be a lawyer?
He was indeed.
He had a reputation, a New York lawyer, had a reputation of being a very smart lawyer.
Is that a plug?
Yes, it is.
He was indeed.
And
And it wasn't just his assessment of himself either. Other people.
Well, but you formed it from the relationship that you had with him. You saw how Casey's mind operated.
That's correct.
It was very quick.
It sure was.
And in these conversations that you were having with the director, it was clear to you that he was concerned about damage to the president.
I think it would be beyond comprehension, counsel, that anyone who served the president, any president, wasn't concerned about that. And that's not from a Republican or Democratic partisan perspective. That is in seeing the president as the commander-in-chief, the chief executive, and the head of state. And I think that it is incumbent upon all of the servants in the executive branch to have that kind of a concern. Not so much for the man, necessarily, but for the institution of the presidency. I certainly had that, and I know Director Casey had that.
Now, on the 25th of November, I withdraw that question. Did you tell Director Casey that you were going to see the Attorney General that Sunday?
I'd already seen him by the 25th of November.
Yeah, that's the 25th. Did you tell him before you saw the Attorney General?
If I may.
Mr. Sullivan hasn't objected to you looking at it.
I do not believe I talked to the director that day about that issue. And again,
what about the prior day?
No, because I didn't know I was going to see him until the 21st. My recollection.
Let's get the dates correct then. On the
okay.
You saw the Attorney General on the 23rd.
On Sunday the 23rd, right?
And you knew that you were going to see him on the 22nd. Is that correct? The Attorney General called for an appointment on the 22nd.
That is correct.
Did you speak to the director after the Attorney General asked to see you?
I do not have a recollection of doing that, no.
Now, when you talked to the director in October after the Furmark incident and in November, did he ever ask you what the memoranda looked like that you had sent up the line and that you either were going to take care of or had taken care of?
I don't believe so, because I think at least on one occasion I actually went over the memorandum with the director.
So he knew what it looked like? That one?
Certainly.
Now, can you recall which transaction was reflected in the memorandum that you went over with the director?
No, but I have a sense that it was probably the February one. But I don't know why I feel that. I think it may have been the February transaction.
February 1 involved 500 hawks and then another 500 hawks, a total of 1,000 hawks, correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall what occasioned you to go over the memorandum with the director?
My recollection is, and it is vague because it was a long time ago, it seems, that I was pursuing getting a CIA officer, a particular CIA officer, engaged in the initiative.
There's only one CIA officer whose name we used with respect to this, and that's Mr. Cave. Is that who you were talking about?
And he is the one.
Now,
I'm sorry.
No, I'd like you to complete your answer.
My sense is that what Director Casey and I started talking about was getting Mr. Cave because of his experience in that country and his obvious language ability, so that we had a person who is, besides myself, in the government of the United States involved in this, and who knew exactly what was being said, and with whom I had absolute rapport. And he chose to make some kind of an arrangement, and I'm not certain what it was, but on a contract basis or consultancy arrangement, bring Mr. Cave back to service. And it is my recollection that we then had I guess it was right after the February transaction, so my date's a little off, but it was at some point in that time frame when I was trying to get Cave involved, and I showed the director one of those memoranda.
No. Colonel, I said 1,000 hawks, I meant toes, and I think that's what you understood.
I did.
Colonel, was the memorandum you showed him the memorandum as it existed before you sent it up the line or after it came back?
It was probably before.
Did the director in any way caution you about not sending a memorandum that called for presidential approval?
I don't recall him ever doing that.
Well,
no.
isn't it fair to say that given your strong sense of command, your belief in Director Casey, that if Director Casey said to you, did not put the president's name on a memorandum, you wouldn't have done it?
Very true.
And you continue to put the president's name in terms of having a reference in the memoranda that Admiral Poindexter should seek approval of the president, correct?
That is certainly my recollection. If we could just go to that.
Well, I'm going to come to it in more detail later, but if you have something that you want to say now, you better say it while you remember it.
Unkind. Again, I would like to make the point that I did not, nor do I know that others did, highlight that aspect of it in those memoranda. And if you will note that the one memorandum that still exists, drafted at some point in April, is 5 pages long with a 4-page attachment, and there are only 8 lines that refer in those many pages to that specific part of the transaction. And what is very important is that the use, and I know that that is the focus of this investigation, but that the use of the funds derived as residuals, as I call them, or you call diversions, was not viewed as the preeminent activity ongoing. The preeminent activity was to establish a relationship with Iran and all of the other things that would derive therefrom. And that we saw, as Director Casey put it, the ultimate irony in that as a part of this process, we could continue to support the desperately needy Nicaraguan resistance.
Colonel, you said that you didn't highlight it. It's also true you didn't conceal it in the memorandum.
I don't think I concealed from my superiors anything that I did, and I think the record is very clear in the stacks of paper that you have.
And the record is very clear in the memorandum that has survived that you didn't conceal it.
I did not.
And indeed, in a rather hurried inspection, Brad Reynolds spotted it pretty quickly, didn't he?
I don't know how long it took him to find it. They spent, many hours in my office that day.
Now,
nor did they reveal it to me when they found it.
Now, they revealed it to you the next day, though, didn't they?
Certainly did.
Now, is the reason that Director Casey asked you after the Furmark incident to get rid of the memoranda because of that one paragraph or two that referred to diversion?
I don't know that that was solely on his mind. I think what the director was concerned about, and I'm quite sure that the director was concerned that you have and this was the mistake that I made, among others perhaps, depending on your perspective, but the operational mistake was to cross the two operations in the person of perhaps this guy here and the others who are having to carry it out. Operationally, if you have other alternatives, you don't do that. And I didn't at the time have other alternatives. Second, I think what Director Casey saw was that there was going to be a major unraveling of the activities. Furmark was part of it. The aircraft shoot down over Nicaragua was part of it. And that was further compounded by early November, when we knew that leaflets were being handed out by another faction within the government of Iran, revealing the May trip by Mr. McFarlane and his party.
But, Colonel, the Hassenfuss shoot-down involved Contra support, correct?
True.
And Furmark was complaining about the fact that investors hadn't gotten paid out of the proceeds of the sale, correct?
No. The problem with the Furmark revelation was that Furmark told him, as I remember it, that Ghorbanifar had already told two members of Congress that monies from the sale of weapons to Iran had been diverted to use of the Contras. And those names are in the notebooks that I gave you, sir.
Well, you gave us a lot of notebooks, and I have not seen those in the notebooks, so I'm going to ask your counsel at a recess to point them out to us. Do you know what the names are?
I don't recall them now, and I sure wouldn't want to be inaccurate on that.
Now, but the director was talking about diversion in terms of Furmark.
The concerns that the director addressed to me was that, look, you've had the shoot down of the Hassenfuss airplane. That operation's in trouble. Furmark has now come and told me that other people are very aware of the fact that the arms sales to Iran have generated funds that have gone to support the Contras, and it's getting out.
Did he say that this had been called to members of Congress who might start an investigation?
I don't recall that part of it, but apparently Ghorbanifar had claimed to Furmark that members of Congress are being made aware, or had been.
And you therefore were told to get rid of memoranda that reflected that.
I was told to clean up the files.
And that meant to you to get rid of memoranda that reflected that, right?
Anything to do with the residuals, or as you call diversion.
And
yes.
That meant that you went through your files to make sure that you found the memoranda that referred to the residuals, as you call them.
Yes.
And when you went through the files, do you recall how many you found?
The specific memoranda seeking approval?
Yes, sir.
No, I don't. And what I probably found were dozens and dozens of memoranda relating to the residuals and the application to the Contra, among other things. And so what I'm saying is, and probably several copies of even the April one, which I thought I'd gotten all of them.
Well, when you say that there were dozens...
all within the 5 that I sought approval for.
So that there were copies of the 5.
Exactly.
And did you look over them to see whose names were written on them?
I think we've already been through this once, Counsel.
You said you didn't recall, and I'm asking you whether you looked.
I don't even remember looking. I remember if there was
Well,
something...
you've answered it then.
Yeah.
You said you did not look. Is that right?
Would you like to answer the question, counsel, for him?
No, I'd like him to keep his answers to the questions, and if that's the answer, then we ought to move on. Is that the answer, that you did not look?
May we have the question, please, Mr. Chairman?
Did you look to see whose names were written on those memos?
I do not recall looking to see whose names were written on the memos.
And do you recall looking to see whether they had check marks or initials?
I do not.
Now, on this day, November 25, did you find time, this is November 25 when you were dismissed, to write out a list of priorities in your notebooks? Things that were important to you. Exhibit.
Yes.
And was that before or after the press conference?
It was after.
Now, when did you take these diaries out of your office, these steno pads?
My recollection is that most, well, not, I don't know if it's most, some were already at home. Some were still in the office, and I think, if I remember right, all but the last one, and maybe even that too, left with me on the afternoon of the 25th.
Now, you've testified over the last few days about the need to maintain operational security in a covert operation, correct?
That's correct.
You testified that one of the reasons for shredding documents was to even keep them from a successor. Is that correct?
A successor to my position at the NSC, yes.
Is it fair to say Mr. Sullivan sees my next question. Is it fair to say that
He sometimes reads my mind too.
is it fair to say that the steno books that you took home contained very sensitive information?
It is likely with interpretation that the steno books are sensitive, yes.
Part of the interpretation is your handwriting.
Well, certainly that, but if you're criticizing my penmanship, I'm...
But there are names in those books.
Yes.
And you indeed uttered a prayer to the committee that we treat these books with sensitivity, and respect their security. You did that yesterday, as I recall. Correct?
I did.
Now, the home that you took these books to is a home that you had a great deal of concern about security for, correct?
Yes.
And can you explain to me, someone who's never been in a position such as yours, as to why you would be concerned about the security of documents locked in an NSC office, subject to all sorts of security regulations and access restrictions, but not concerned about keeping them at home?
Well, again, as I said, I may have had a few of them at home. I don't really recall how many, if indeed there were. I removed the rest of them on the 25th, along with several hundred pages of other documents, for one purpose, and that was to protect myself. Because after the press conference, my perspective changed, and it became one of protecting myself. And that was the reason to remove those notebooks from the NSC and to take those documents from the White House with me.
Now, when did you do your shredding before the 25th, which was the last preceding day in which you did shredding that was out of the ordinary?
It is entirely likely that I was shredding documents as late as the morning of the 25th.
Did the Attorney General, when you met with him on the 23rd, ask you to preserve every single document?
No.
Did you, when you returned from your meeting with the Attorney General on the 23rd, go to your office and do shredding of documents that day?
I honestly don't remember, but I know I shredded documents after that fact. You're talking about after the Sunday
After the
interview?
meeting with the Attorney General where he confronted you with the diversion memo?
I think what I did, if I remember it all accurately, a time that was becoming increasingly difficult, in your words, my recollection is that I went back to the White House to try and call Admiral Poindexter on the telephone. And he had, on a rare Sunday afternoon, I guess, when he could get away with his family, gone to the Redskins game. You plug New York lawyers, I plug the Redskins. As I recall, he was not yet home. And it was probably then, if I called Mr. McFarland, that I called him, and probably from the sit room. And I would guess that I probably went back to my office at that point and for some time continued to clean up the files. I would also point out to the committee that I destroyed documents that had absolutely nothing to do with either Iran or the Nicaraguan resistance, that no longer would be applicable in the event that I was soon to be transferred.
Do you recall that on Monday morning, the 24th, the shredder was full and overflowing?
I don't remember that it was necessarily Monday, but I do remember that happened at some point, yes.
Do you remember shredding documents during the lunch hour on the 22nd, when the representatives of the Attorney General's office had left for their lunch?
I remember shredding documents while they were in there reading documents.
You're shredding them in their presence?
Well, I mean, they were sitting in my office, and the shredder was right outside, and I walked out and shredded documents.
More than a few pieces of paper, right?
Pardon?
It will be more than a few pieces of paper.
Well, that's a pretty high-speed shredder. It eats them pretty quick. And I'm not trying to be light about it, but I mean, they were sitting in my office reading, and I'd finish a document, say we don't need that anymore. I'd walk up and I'd go out and shred it. They could hear it. The shredder was right outside the door.
Well, I'm not trying to be light about it either,
I'm not
that you would go up there and take documents that they had finished reading?
No. I want to be very clear. They were sitting, I had my office, and you've now had a diagram of this palatial basement office on the 3rd floor of the old EOB. It was up on the wall here somewhere. And the desk that I had was in the corner of my office, and then there was a table about this size, and on that table was laid out all of the Iran documents. And I was working at my desk on other things, literally cleaning up files on lots of things. And when I'd finish with a handful of documents, I'd walk up, walk past them, walk out the door, you know where the shredder was, turn the corner, turn on the shredder, and drop them in.
And did anyone say to you, Colonel, what are you doing?
No, and I didn't think anything of it either. I mean, you know, what you got to understand, counsel, is that I didn't think I'd done anything wrong.
Well, I understand.
Okay, and I don't think that they necessarily thought that I had done anything wrong. And so an officer who's got a shredder in his office ought to be, if he's not on the telephone or reading or writing documents and needs to get rid of them, puts them in the shredder.
Well, the record is that before lunch hour, Mr. Reynolds found the diversion document.
But he didn't
and
tell
I know he
me.
didn't tell you, Colonel, so if you wait for the question, you're going to get your opportunity to answer. I'm not interrupting your answers.
Yes.
Not at all. He found that document. He attached significance to that document. And what you're saying is that even after that, which occurred before lunch, you were there taking batches of documents past these attorneys from the Department of Justice and shredding them, and they weren't saying, stop, we'd like to look, what are you doing, we're concerned, none of that, right?
I'm not trying to leave the wrong impression, counsel. Okay, what I'm saying to you is, I thought, and perhaps they thought, and I'm trying to be in several people's mind at once, is that they were looking for the facts on what had transpired in September and October, November of 1985. All right? And what I was told they were looking for, I thought was in the files that I gave them. Let me finish. I was also engaged in a number of other projects of national security importance. The fact that I was shredding documents, I don't think would be unusual to them. This was, after all, an office with a shredder in it. I mean, I'm not trying to say that these guys were just letting me willy-nilly go and shred documents. I had a shredder for that purpose. If I'd finished reading a top-secret cable of intelligence value, you don't leave those things sitting around your office. You destroy them after you read them. And that's what I was doing.
Were you taking single documents over to the shredder, or were you taking files over to the shredder?
I was not taking files. I would go through a file. I was sitting at my desk. They were working 10 feet from me. And we would go, they were working on their projects. I was working on mine.
I want to hear more about it. Go ahead.
Well,
I'm
no,
not interrupting.
I don't think you ought to accuse them of incompetence because they stopped a guy from doing his job. That's why the government of the United States gave me a shredder.
But your job on that day was to get rid of files, wasn't it? That's what you came in for.
No, that isn't what I came in for. I was working desperately, among other things, and I received 2 or 3 phone calls on it to keep the hostages alive. Good grief, we'd had this stuff all over the newspapers. The Israelis were calling me every half hour, and I was working with those people. They heard me taking the phone calls.
Colonel,
I was also in the process of looking after several other action packages that I had to move across the street on totally unrelated issues.
Colonel, was your work on the phone with the Israelis leading you to shred documents?
Objection.
On occasion.
Weren't you going through your files to get rid of embarrassing documents?
Embarrassing? No. Documents that would compromise the national security of the United States, documents that would put lives at risk, documents that would demonstrate a covert action in the U.S. direction and control and relationship to it, yes. Embarrassing? No. I'm not embarrassed to be here, counsel.
Are you saying, Colonel, that it would... What? You just keep going with it. Don't you think so? Never they want to. Are you saying, Colonel, that you thought that allowing the Attorney General of the United States or his representatives to see documents would jeopardize lives?
No. What I'm saying to you, counsel, is that revelations regarding those documents would destroy lives. Many of the documents that I destroyed that day, prior to that day, and after that day had absolutely no relationship to the Iranian activities. They had to do with Nicaraguan resistance activities. They had to do with counter-terrorist operations. Things that were, just as this committee has, I think, a scope within which they operate, they were looking for specific Iranian associated activities. And thus, if I had a file of matters pertaining to support for the internal opposition in Nicaragua, or people who I had contacted in Europe and with whom I had worked to get weapons for the Nicaraguan resistance, and sitting there at my desk, I would pull those out and look at them and say, North, if you're not here tomorrow, this doesn't need to be found by anybody. I would take them over to the shredder and destroy them. That's what I'm saying.
Colonel,
it was beyond the pale of their inquiry.
Colonel, those were files that you had assembled over time, correct?
5.5 years, sir.
And those were files that had remained secure for 5.5 years. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you knew whoever your successor was, who would occupy that office, would be someone who was selected by the National Security Advisor. Is that correct?
I did not know that the person who moved into that office would share the same responsibilities or indeed have anything to do with the matters in which I had worked. And the documents that existed in the permanent files were all that were necessary to carry on whatever other, the activities in which I was engaged, and it was only a part of my work, counsel, in support of the Nicaraguan resistance and in support of the Iranian initiative, were being terminated. There was no need to retain those documents.
Do you deny, Colonel, that one of the reasons that you were shredding documents that Saturday was to avoid the political embarrassment of having these documents be seen by the Attorney General's staff?
I do not deny that.
I think this is a good time for a break.
The hearing will stay in recess for 10 minutes.
Senate Caucus Room, nation's capital. We're going into the final hours of the third day of testimony by Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Just to his left there in a blue print dress is his wife Betsy, making her first appearance today. He has described her as his best friend. Lieutenant Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's row of ribbons begins with a Silver Star, works its way down through a Bronze Star, won in combat in Vietnam. He made reference to Vietnam today when he was asked whether the day he was fired was the worst day of his life, and he said no, there were other worse days when young Marines were dying. 11 months in combat, twice wounded in Vietnam. Fought his way into the Marines after graduating from the Naval Academy.
The hearing will please come to order. Mr. Liman, please proceed.
Colonel?
Counsel?
Do you remember, Colonel, that in the early morning of between Sunday night and Monday morning, after your interview with the Attorney General, that the alarm in your office was tripped because you were there shredding?
I don't recall the alarm being tripped, but I do remember being in the office until very, very early in the morning.
And it's Exhibit 155, but if you remember being there till early in the morning, that's enough, and you were there shredding, am I correct?
Can we take a look at the exhibit? Does the exhibit say I was there shredding?
No, the exhibit just gives your explanation of what happened, 155.
What it is a indication from the security center that the alarm in my office had gone off, and that the alarm was cleared, and I was there until 04:15 in the morning.
And the following morning, Miss Brown told us that the shredder was full. Does that refresh you?
I don't deny that. I don't remember that it was. I fully and completely have testified, counsel, that I shredded documents, I believe, right up until the morning of the 25th when I departed.
Do you remember at all telling your secretary at one point that you were leaving a document that the Justice Department could have fun with?
I do not recall that.
Do you remember?
On what day did I allegedly do this?
21st.
I do not recall that.
Give me the page. And if you don't recall it, you don't remember what the document was.
I don't recall the conversation, nor do I recall the thought. I'm not denying that I said it. Those were, as you indicated earlier, counsel, difficult times. Trying to maintain a sense of humor under those circumstances is difficult at best.
Now, do you recall, and I don't want to belabor this, believe me, but we have to get facts.
I am here to give you the facts, counsel.
Do you recall that on that Saturday when the Justice Department representatives left for lunch, that you left the room with Commander Thompson and with a group of documents that you had to shred in the West Wing because your shredder was no longer working? that ring any bell with you, sir?
It does not, but I do know that I used the shredder, which was identical in the West Wing to mine, on a number of occasions.
Do you recall using it in that period?
I don't, but I certainly don't deny it.
And did you use it when your shredder was full and not operational?
I may have. But again, counsel, I'm not denying that. I may well have. If someone said that I did, it is entirely likely that I did do that.
Did you tell Admiral Poindexter that you were going to be shredding documents other than the diversion documents which you had said you had already gotten rid of?
I don't recall specifically saying that, but I do recall assuring him on a number of occasions that I had taken care of my files, that I had shredded things, that basically the files were cleaned up. That was the basic input.
I want to move to another topic, Colonel.
Before we leave that, if we may, counsel, again, I well recognize that there are certainly people who think it might have been something else, but the efforts to destroy those documents over the course of that period of time beginning in October, I never once believed to be anything criminal at all. I did not believe that anything I had done to that point was criminal. And I didn't think that it was anything other than preserving the integrity of activities and operations, the lives of people who were out there at stake, the various things that I had done that no longer were relevant. Some of them were history and never would be done again. Simply didn't need to be exposed in any way. And one cannot be certain, in an expansive answer to your comment, that whoever came in would be chosen by a national security advisor. I'm not certain that one ought to rest with the assurance that the person that comes in to replace you shares your same values or necessarily shares the same perspective that you have on a number of things. And I'm not saying I have an exclusive view of what is right or wrong. I believe that the things I did were right, and I believe that the lives of the people with whom I worked needed to be protected. I knew that the successor that was coming in wasn't going to do that. The CIA was now back actively engaged in support of the Nicaraguan resistance. And the names and the addresses and the places and the people with whom I had worked during the period of time in which the CIA was not engaged need not be exposed by anybody. And I want you to know that that was a lot of what was going through my mind.
Colonel, since you chose to give that answer, I'm not going to leave the subject for a moment. First, let me make a statement that it will probably provide no comfort to you for you to understand that we are not prosecutors here, and we're not here to assess criminal responsibility. I understand that there is an independent counsel somewhere working in other offices, but you should understand that our assessment is of a different nature.
Counsel, I understand that you're saying that, but I have heard members of this committee who have said that I did wrong, that I wouldn't even need counsel, or that I wouldn't have abided by my rights under the Constitution, but for the fact that I had done wrong. And I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now.
Are you saying, sir, that you do not believe that it was wrong to misrepresent facts to the Congress of the United States?
I have admitted that, but I didn't think it was criminal.
I'm not talking about what was criminal. You just chose the word wrong. Are you saying, sir, that it wasn't wrong to misrepresent facts to the Attorney General of the United States?
I have testified as to what I believed to be right and wrong before, and
Now,
you have had that, and it's on the record.
Now, Colonel, you have talked about the fact that you didn't know who your successor would be, and that was one of the reasons for engaging in all of this activity in the days before you left office. Correct?
That is correct.
The one thing you knew was that people taking tours of the White House couldn't go into your office and look at the files there, right?
Not without the combination of my door.
And the other thing that you knew was that the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, whom you respect and revere, and I suspect love, had asked the Attorney General to do a fact-finding mission. That's correct, isn't it?
Actually, I don't know that Admiral Poindexter, when he told me about the fact-finding inquiry on the 21st, that he specified that it was the President who had asked that that be done, but I did come to know that. That is correct.
Would it have made a difference to you in your actions if you felt that the Attorney General was proceeding on the specific instructions of the President as opposed to the Admiral?
Would what have made a difference? That my actions
Whether or
be
not-
any different?
Yes, sir.
Objection. It's a hypothetical question.
Would
Just
you-
pure speculation.
You say that you were not sure whether the Attorney General was conducting this inquiry at the request of the President or at the request of the Admiral. That's what I heard you say.
No, what I said was I don't know that the Admiral told me on the 21st that the President, at least I don't recall knowing at the time, that the Admiral told me that this was being done at the request of the President. He may well have told me that.
Would you have shredded less documents on the 22nd if you had been told that the Attorney General was acting at the specific request of the President, your Commander-in-Chief?
Objection.
What is the basis of your objection,
It's
sir?
pure speculation. Dreamland. It has two ifs in it, and Mr. Liman knows better than most that
May I
those
advise-
kinds of questions, Mr. Chairman, are wholly inappropriate, not just because of rules of evidence, not because you couldn't say it in a court, but because it's just dreamland. It's speculation. He says, if you'd done this, and if you'd done that, and if you'd done that, what about this? Come on, let's have, Mr.
I'm
Chairman,
certain, counsel-
plain fairness. Plain fairness. That's
May I
all we're
speak,
asking
sir?
for.
May I speak?
Yes, sir.
I'm certain counsel realizes that this is not a court of law.
Believe me, I know that.
And I'm certain you realize that the rules of evidence do not apply in this inquiry.
That I know as well. I'm just asking for fairness. Fairness. I know the rules don't apply. I know the Congress doesn't recognize attorney-client privilege, a husband and wife privilege, priest-penitent privilege. I know those things are all out
We
the
have
window,
attempted
and we
to be
rely
as
on
fair
just
as we
fairness,
can.
Mr. Chairman. Fairness.
Let
Please.
the witness object if he wishes to.
Well, sir, I'm not a potted plant. I'm here as the lawyer. That's my job.
Mr. Liman, please proceed with that question.